terms of Thoth in the book God King Akhenaten, about the Syrian origins of Akhenaten and Thoth, whom we will discuss today. So lots to the pineal story. Pining away. To learn how to pine, to yearn, is reflected in the Sufi, charge the battery of yearning. Because pining is phase conjugate.
Would you talk a little about external input, in that subliminally there's a specific resolution that they hide messages and deliver them in. Can you do stuff like that with your blinking if you wanted to see auras?
The blink rate is quite profound. In fact, in the technology used for electronic induction of hypnosis, that's what's modulated. It's a pulse width modulated optical device that induces hypnosis based on alpha and theta harmonics, etc. So the blink rate is profound. Remember in the movie Andromeda Strain, where the the red light blinked at the wrong rate and triggered the epileptic seizure? And we know that epilepsy is just a false turn on the way to bliss, actually. In a body that desperately needs bliss and can't get there, you have the phenomenon of epilepsy.
And is there something to what you did yesterday where you made the phi spiral? But it depends on which hand and which eye.
That there is a difference.
Which Francois is so much into?
Yeah, just that the right-left hemisphere and the right-left hand differ significantly in terms of the electrical nature of centripetal versus centrifugal. So normally when you're looking in your hand, you're looking in your left hand.
Yes.
Well, when you're projecting, you're using your right hand.
And that gives you an indication of your individual polarity?
Well,
because it goes both ways.
But right-left archetypally would be.
Yes.
And even when you're restoring people who have lost polarity using magnets under the feet, if the magnet's polarity is correct, you can restore polarity quickly. It's good for acute condition and not for chronic. Remember, in the alphabet of the heart, the symmetry of the muscles at the center of the hand also can be used to make the alphabet.
Would you talk on the z-axis of the torus around the Earth grid? We've got the North and the South Pole. Is it fluctuating in constant gyroscopic motion? Is that the PowerPoint that the pyramids were laid onto, but is it flux now?
What is being introduced here is the fact that many artists, including Universal One and others, have suggested that the Earth's spin symmetry axis, like any true magnetic domain, is actually octahedral. And so there's always a belly of the North Pole symmetry. And as you see, as a torus would gain resolution, the subcomponents of that torus would then introduce the tetracube octasymmetry. So the equator phenomena would have a very significant electrical.
But we're wobbling all the time.
Nutation precession. Well, we'll talk about that maybe later, but just here, seeing that the spiritual literature is quite clear that people closer to the equator actually have a greater chance of conscious evolution electrically. And that's been supposedly documented, that people far from the equator have a harder time triggering bliss, actually, because it has to do with access to the sun.
That 33rd degree.
Yeah, there's a whole bunch of stories about that. Yeah.
Well, don't hide that stuff. I mean,
Access to the sun is introduction to the sun god conversation today. Atun left when the sun disappeared. Atun goes away. That's the story from Egypt, and it's good physics.
So that means, like, just to follow that train of thought, and I really do want to get back to our history of the galaxy, because that's why we're here today. But, for example, people who live in the northern hemisphere tend to be more intellectual, and they've created more science and stuff like that. And you would find people in Latin America being more in the heart.
Or more passion.
More passion.
Yes, yes. And the people also near the equator are more subject to addiction, however. Like in southern Europe, tobacco use is increasing radically. And because in the southern...
That could be marketing too.
Well, but I think in southern latitudes where you have more access to the sun, if you don't know how to do a bliss experience, it increases the addiction tendency. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yes?
What about with, one of the things over the summer that I've been practicing is working with lightning and waterfalls. Hooking into that and riding those.
Lightning and waterfalls.
Lightning, waterfalls, and then adding in the sun. Staring at the sun. and bringing those in for the charge and just riding that?
And that's how a scientist would describe how to make ozone, actually. And indeed, it's perfect. It's how to bond oxygen into fire. It's a good metaphor. And also the physics of the origin of primal soup. You get the spark, combine the spark with the protein liquids, and the charge compression can induce the next axis of helically superposed spin rotation. And so in the primal soup, the proteins became DNA because of lightning.
Okay, because I was wondering what I was doing, because I spent the last couple of weeks just now by waterfalls and out in the sun, and I'm telling you, I could do that all my whole life.
Yeah, it's ozone density there, which is exquisitely fractal for the air. And so charge distribution efficiency goes way up. It's a beautiful thing.
So the same thing happened after a major rainstorm.
Precisely, very healthy. Particularly
Or a shower, yes.
rain with lightning would be excellent. Yes, for your orb.
Yesterday you were talking about measuring the coherence with what, that HeartMath with Glenn Ryan or something like that. But how does that tie in with the question on the holotropic mind? In other words, the intensity of the imagery of the synapses creating a holographic mind. How does that correlate with the coherence of the heart or the measurement?
That's exactly the issue. We're saying that when the heart becomes internally phase coherent, and that is the subject for tomorrow, that allows the heart to become turned from a flashlight into a laser. And that same form of coherence is what turns the brain hologram into a laser. And what we're saying is the climax form of coherence is fractal in both the case of the heart and the brain. So that question will hopefully take on more meaning tomorrow when we show you the mathematics we use to calculate coherence, which is a second order power spectra, the cepstrum. So indeed, turning biology into a laser is precisely what the word ka, the coherence of your boat to the underworld, the coherence of your biology's charge field, whether you survive death, is that coherence. And the EKG and EEG are just one of many ways in which biology gets there. Yes?
Is that analogy of turning a flashlight into a laser, the increased density in the synaptic firing in the brain, which is focus, versus...
Precisely, that it's not just the density of the firing, but it's the phase discipline of the firing, so that you get the square wave at the synapse with a billion other square waves at synapse, and when they lock into phase properly, the entire hologram becomes coherent. And that's where the alpha and the theta getting to golden mean ratio, perfect caduceus, massive compression wave involving billions of neurons, creates a fractal charge attractor called enlightenment. And literally the end of all forms of addiction, attention deficit, and the beginning of bliss.
So what you're saying there sounds very similar to a Class D amplifier.
A Class D amplifier.
Yes.
Say what that is?
A Class D amplifier is where they basically take, an audio input, which is, fairly random type as, combination of sine waves, and they actually create a series of square waves and recombine them at the ends to create the, amplified audio signal.
So that you have noise reduction in the process?
Well, theoretically it works out mathematically. In reality, the THD isn't always the best, but it is extremely efficient, obviously, because you're dealing with square waves rather than, partially turned on transistors. But it, like I said, it's a bunch of square waves combining together to create sine waves, or any combination thereof, say audio.
The thing is, a square wave is theoretically harmonically infinite if the square is really sharp. But if there were a square wave of the right geometry, the harmonics would be log functions of golden ratio, and then it would be implosive. And that's what the Hutchinson spark gap making gravity does, actually, the Hutchinson effect. So the concept of square wave is, but maybe that's a little bit beyond some of us here, so we may believe that.
Yeah, the perfect square wave is impossible to create.
Yeah, that's the point. But maybe you could.
There's always the Gibbs phenomenon, anyways.
Maybe you could get the perfect square wave if you had log functions of 5. Maybe it'd be the perfect pent wave.
No, to create a perfect square wave actually would involve time travel.
That's right. You'd have charge acceleration through the speed of light, precisely, which, if you look at the Hutchinson device, they're making gravity with spark gaps. Anyway, but this is more leaving some people behind here, so let's do that later.
But
Yeah.
Hutchinson is
Thank you.
Hutchinson, the guy who levitates things.
Exactly. Yeah, it's a spark gap. And then he makes gravity. He doesn't have a clue of the principle. Yes.
Oh, I don't want to go off on that.
No, that's okay. If we go there, we might get lost. Or are we already lost? Okay. So, The story.
Sorry.
The story.
Yay! This is going to be, the next Star Wars series, by the way.
Yeah, this is the next Star Wars series. Okay.
Certainly couldn't be any worse than the last one.
One of the titles of today's story is The Stellar Ignition of DNA. And to understand that part of the story, it's important that we have in mind the climax from yesterday. Because that's the theme of the whole story, is the stellar ignition of DNA. So just a very 2-minute review of the climax of yesterday. We were looking at DNA saying, look, in the braiding process in DNA, when you have bliss, the phase cascade of your EKG, EEG allows the recursive braiding of the DNA to create an envelope within an envelope where the wavelength of this braid is embedded in the wavelength of this braid with recursive phase discipline. That results in a condition in the DNA which is ultimately probably toroidal, based on the 7th recursive braid, makes a donut, causing implosion. And we suggested that that was the physics of the Lord of the Ring. Yes? That why the alphabet on the side of the ring donut, Hungarian Finnish, was from Alpha Draconis, which is a software environment for teaching genes, DNA, to absorb charge, because at the symmetry point of the helix, where the DNA is actually eating the charge field that causes it to grow, the codons are arranged tetrahedrally, and that's the origin of the tetra alphabets like Hebrew, and that controlled DNA's ability to swallow charge. And then we discussed